So I am pleased that we have Dr. Thomas Jay Oord for our first Sunday school session. I'm excited for what he's going to teach us today. And you're all, if you're joining the Zoom call, yes, you are muted right now, and that's for a reason, because we don't want a lot of hullabaloo going on until the Q&A time. All right, so hang on to your questions, write your questions down, and Dr. Thomas Jay Oord will address those during Q&A time. Let me introduce Tom to you all. Tom is a professor, a scholar, and a theologian, a researcher, especially in the fields of open relational theology, but also love, science and faith, or science and religion, and lots of other topics. He's an interdisciplinarian in the truest sense of the word. Touches on so many different topics and brings them all together into the heading really of love and God and love. He is the published award-winning author of, I think over 25 works, and author and editor of over 25 different books, and is a multiple award-winning professor as well. And he is the founder and director of the Center for Open and Relational Theology, which is a fantastic, exciting thing, and maybe he'll talk a little bit about that. But I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and then I'm going to let Dr. Oord teach us for a bit. All right.
Thanks so much. All right. Thanks for that introduction, Cody. And thanks to all of you for tuning in for this discussion. I want to jump right to the issue that at least I've been thinking about a lot the last month or so, and I'm guessing a lot of you have been thinking about. And that's the question of where is God in the midst of this pandemic, or what's God up to in relation to the coronavirus? I don't know about you, but I've been reading lots of social media posts in which people are giving explanations. And well, to be honest, most of the explanations people give, I just don't find satisfactory. I don't find ultimately plausible. For instance, I hear some people saying that the virus is God's punishment. God is angry at the sin in the world, and therefore God is sending this virus as some kind of way to teach us a lesson. I don't believe that a God of love is in the business of killing people. And that's what this pandemic is doing, let alone the harm, the suffering that people who aren't dying are feeling, and the rest of us who are being inconvenienced in some way. I don't think a God of love is punishing us by causing or even allowing the coronavirus. Other people say God isn't punishing us, but God has this mysterious plan, this blueprint in mind to teach us a lesson. God is either causing or allowing this coronavirus because God, wants us to come together, or is trying to help us to understand we need to be less consumeristic, or wants to help combat climate change. These people, I think, rightly point to the positive impact or positive effects that may come about because of suffering in the world, and in this case, the coronavirus. But it sounds as if God is the one who is causing it, and again, or even allowing it. But again, this tends to paint God in an unloving way. I mean, if I have the opportunity to prevent evil in the world, but I choose not to do so, then you don't consider me a loving person. If Cody and I are walking down the street and a couple of people jump out and put their hands around Cody's neck and start to strangle him, and I have the kind of power to actually save Cody's life, but I say, Cody's going to learn a lesson here, and I let him die, he is not going to say I'm a loving God. His wife is not going to think I'm very loving. But lots of people think that God is allowing the coronavirus to teach us some kind of a lesson. And what's really strange about that view, at least the way I see it, is that the people who are the most vulnerable, the aged and the sick, are the ones who are being harmed the most. In fact, the ones who are typically dying. And so this doesn't seem like they're the ones who are really learning the lesson. Other people who see the problems with saying God is causing this coronavirus or just allowing it say that, well, God must be watching us at a distance, on the sidelines, eating popcorn, seeing us scramble around trying to survive in this kind of world. This is Bette Midler's God who's watching us from a distance, uninvolved, detached. Maybe God created the world and started things rolling, and thanks to evolution and other things, we are where we are, but God is now hands-off policy. I don't think that's a good way to go either. The problem with that view is, of course, it's hard to account for those activities in the world in which we think are really inspired by God, including, for some of us at least, our religious experiences, these powerful experiences we have that we think are somehow linked to God's presence in our lives. This morning, I want to place a different view of God and the coronavirus on the table for us to discuss. And when I say to discuss, I mean I really would like to hear your questions about this proposal, and Cody's going to help with that process of this Q&A. Here's the proposal I have on the table. What if God is a God of love? God is always active at every realm or complexity of existence, from the quarks to the viruses to the cells to worms and dogs and elephants and humans and society. What if God is active at all levels, but never controlling? And what if God's lack of control, in the sense of single-handedly bringing about some result, what if this lack of control isn't God saying, you know, I could stop this virus, but I'm just going to let it go. I'm just going to allow it. What if God's very nature is uncontrolling love, and God can't stop the coronavirus single-handedly? God simply can't, not because God's some little weakling doing nothing. God is actively involved, always engaging, but God requires some kind of cooperation or the conditions of creation to be conducive to the kind of results God wants. So this is not a God on the sidelines. This is a God who's active, opposing evil, calling us and all creation to join in that opposition so that our actions really matter. But this God can't single-handedly bring an end to the suffering of our world. Now, there's true hope that suffering will eventually be overcome, but not because God eventually said, you know, I've had it trying to work with this world. I'm just going to bring this about, boom, single-handedly. But evil is overcome as we and others in creation cooperate with this God of love. Now, there are lots of implications of this view, and I'd like to hear some of your questions about it. But before we go to Q&A, let me mention one really important implication. Nearly all of us have been hearing folks say that we ought to do things to combat the spread of this virus. You know, social distancing, not going to the store as much, you know, being careful about how we sneeze and all kinds of things. Those things really matter in the view I'm proposing. In other words, the kind of things that you and I are already trying to do to oppose this virus, to try to make sure it doesn't spread, fit really well with the view that I'm proposing that says that God is also active, but God requires our cooperation in order to overcome evil. I call this view the uncontrolling love of God. That God's love for everyone and everything means that God can't control anyone or anything. So that's the overall kind of view that I want to put on the table. I've developed this in a recent book called God Can't: How to Believe in God and Love After Tragedy, Abuse, and Other Evils. And in a previous book called The Uncontrolling Love of God. And lots of other people have interacted with these ideas in various books, one called The Uncontrolling Love book. I'm not here to promote books. I'm here to promote this idea because I think this idea can really be helpful to all of us, at least all of us who believe in God, as we try to think about God's love and activity in light of the current pandemic. So if you got some questions and you have access to Zoom and you want to type them in there, go for it. Cody, let me turn it over to you to kind of direct this. That might help me well, you know better how to work this.
First of all, thank you for that confidence in me that I have this figured out. I appreciate that. Yes, if you're joining us on Zoom, there is a function that you can use where you can raise your hand. There's an icon you can push to raise your hand, but maybe it might be best if you just wave at the camera somehow, or let me know that you have a question, and we will take your question, okay? Or you can type them in the chat function. And of course, if you're listening on Facebook Live, let us know your questions in the live stream. By the way, Tom, 31 people right now are joining us via Facebook Live. And we do have a question from there. So I'm going to go ahead and read this question and let you address it while perhaps people on the Zoom call might be formulating their question. So the question comes from Joe Case on Facebook Live, and his question is it cooperating with God to pray for God to enhance our immunity systems? Or is my immunity only enhanced or protected through social distancing and the like? Where is that fine line that distinguishes between God's abilities and our cooperation?
Oh, what a great question. And I think I might address it by talking about prayer in general. And because I'm guessing some other folks might have questions about prayer. How does petitionary prayer in particular fit in this kind of perspective? And Joe is particularly asking, what about, immune systems, the virus, et cetera? So let me sort of stand back for a second and kind of look at prayer from various theological views and then hone in on my view in relation to Joe's good question. There are some people in the world who think that God controls absolutely everything. In fact, they think God predestined, foreknew everything that's going to happen. The whole world has already been settled, determined, and complete. If that's your view, I'll just put it for myself. If that were my view of who God was, man, I would have a hard time getting motivated to pray, petitionary prayers. Because if the future's already been settled and complete, nothing I do is going to change the future. In fact, even my desire to want to have to pray or not pray has already been controlled by God. So I won't go into details, but I just have a hard time seeing how any kind of petitionary prayer makes any difference if God has already predetermined all the outcomes. Most people, though, don't have that view of God's power. Most people, I know at least, think God is acting in the world and sometimes single-handedly controls, but other times doesn't. And therefore sometimes gives free will, or there's chance in the world and God allows chance to go on. But occasionally God will, quote, intervene or supernaturally step in and bang out some kind of result single-handedly. Now, if you want to pray to that kind of God, and you think that God is perfectly loving and wiser than you are, it seems kind of weird to be asking the God of the universe, who can do anything God wants to do single-handedly, and who loves everyone all the time, and who knows everything. It's kind of weird to be asking that God to stop the coronavirus. I mean, if God can do it single-handedly and God loves everyone, why doesn't God just up and do it whether or not we pray? I mean, is God sort of standing on the sidelines, arms folded, saying, Cody, you've only asked me to stop the coronavirus 25 times, and I ain't going to do anything until you pray 80 times. That paints a picture of a God who has to be begged, cajoled. God has to be pleaded or somehow tricked into doing something that God could just up and do single-handedly without our prayers. My view says this: God is really affected by our prayers. God is a relational God who gives and receives in ongoing moment-by-moment relationship. But we also live in an interrelated world, such that my actions really have an effect on others. Right now, they're having an effect on you all. My actions have an effect on my environment. My decisions have an effect on my body. My body affects my mind. There's all kinds of interrelatedness. In that kind of world, my prayers, because they influence God and influence others and influence my body, can actually open up new opportunities or avenues for God to work in. It's like my prayers become new data with which God can work moment by moment. That doesn't mean that my prayers somehow turbocharge God so that God can single-handedly fix things and when God couldn't previously. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that my prayers can make a real difference. So now let's go to Joe's case. What's my prayer doing in relation to someone who's suffering the flu symptoms from the virus? Is it having any kind of effect? Well, I think it is having a kind of effect. Again, it doesn't mean that God can just single-handedly fix things now, but because my prayers affect me, affect the person I'm praying for, and because there's a psychosomatic relationship within all of us, our prayers can make a real difference without being controlling.
All right. I like the way you handled that. Very good. Great question. Okay. So what would you say to somebody? Does anyone, by the way, on our Zoom call, anyone have a question? Matthew, do you have a question? I can unmute you. All right. Bob, got a question? Nope. He's shaking his head no. Kaylee, got a question?
Maybe on the Zoom call, what do you think about folks typing in the chat, question in the chat there? Then you could just sort of, you could be really in control.
That's right. I like that. Yeah. So if you do have one, type it there and let me check the Facebook stream. But while we're doing that, let me ask, oh, here we go. Okay, Dakota James asks this question from the Facebook Live. What is the role of ignorance in this pandemic? How does the ignorance of some impact the ability of God to work in the world? In other words, those that don't see the need for social distance, etc. So how are people's unwillingness to cooperate affecting the ability of God to work in the world?
Great question. Great question. I think God always works in relationship to creatures and the possibilities present in any situation. Right now, to use this ignorance idea, the world community doesn't have a solution to this pandemic. We don't have a cure for this virus. We don't have an antibiotic to fight against it. So our ignorance as a reality, as a world, is part of what's preventing the kind of healing God wants to do but can't do single-handedly. Dakota is asking a more specific question. What about an individual person's ignorance? Does that play a role? And it does, because again, God takes all the data present, our prayers, our actions, our lack of action, our lack of knowledge, and works with whatever's possible given the circumstances. So if someone doesn't realize that they need to keep physical distance from others and goes shopping and comes into interaction with others with flu, and then, you can see all the domino effects and negativity that goes on here. God has to work with that as well. God's always working, God's always acting, but our choices, our actions, our in ignorance actually makes a difference also in what's possible in the world.
All right, a good question, great answer. So my question is this. So let's suppose everything in theology for me is filtered through my role as a pastor. That's just kind of my perspective. And so I find a lot of help and ways I can comfort people with your idea, but I also find that some people really at least initially, find a lot more comfort in the idea that God, look, I want to know that God will do this. It brings me comfort to know that God can do this and will do this. And how do you respond as put on your pastor's lens? How do you respond as a pastor to people who maybe right now are struggling with, you're telling me that I feel like you're saying that God is weak and God can't tackle this?
Well, I'm saying that God can't single-handedly bring about results, but I'm not saying God is weak. In fact, I even used the word almighty to talk about God's action. I just don't think that God is almighty and yet has the ability to control. But I think your broader question is, okay, how does this make people feel, and what kind of assurance or comfort does it give? And let me be very honest to say that, yeah, most people, when they hear my proposal that God can't single-handedly bring about results in the world, like stopping this pandemic, that doesn't make them feel very comfortable. But then I ask them this question: how is the idea that God could bring about these results single-handedly, could stop the coronavirus, but is choosing not to? How does that make you feel? Especially those who are survivors and victims of evil. One of the really meaningful aspects of this recent book that I wrote, God Can't, is the letters that I'm getting from people who have gone through horrific situations, been victims of torture or sexual abuse or other kinds of misfortune. And they write back and they say, finally, there's a view of God which says that God is not standing by on the sidelines allowing things. So for their perspective, this view is comforting. It's satisfactory. It makes them feel like God can really be a God of love because God didn't stand back and allow the crap that happened to them. So when I'm talking to people in the church who have that kind of first initial reaction, oh, this God is a wimp, this God's not doing anything, I try to reassure them that God is doing things. God is perfectly loving. God is the mightiest, but God is uncontrolling. And that's really good news when you see horrific things happen in the world and then you wonder what God was up to.
All right, I have a question from on Facebook Live, a couple of them. One is, this is a good one here. If you are talking, this is from Kaylissa. She asks, if you are talking about a God with limitations that relies on us, who puts those limitations on God? How does that work with the characteristics of omnipotence and omnipresence that we often use to define God?
Awesome question. Yeah. This word omnipotence, most people know, is not found in the Bible. It's an attempt to try to find language to describe God's power. But even the most conservative Christian theologians in history have said that there are limitations to what God can do. Now, they say these things because they look at various kinds of aspects or ideas. First of all, many of them know that the Bible itself says that God can't do some things. God can't tell a lie, for instance. God can't be tempted, for instance. God can't grow tired, says the psalmist. My favorite passage is one in which Paul is writing, and he says, when we are faithless, God remains faithful because God cannot deny himself. Now, most Christian theologians have said that whatever we think about God's power, we shouldn't say that God can do what is illogical. God can't make a married bachelor. God can't make a rock so big that even God can't lift it. God can't make 2 + 2 = 394, etc. And then there's some of us, and I'm in this camp, who've said that God can't contradict God's own nature, and we cite that biblical passage. So like if we think that God is omnipresent, that's one of the things you mentioned, that means that God has to be present to all of reality because that's who God is. That's God's very nature. God can't say, I just don't want to be in Clarkston next week. Nope. God's going to be present to all of reality all of the time because that's who God is. So omnipotence or sovereignty or almightiness, whatever word you like to use to talk about God's power, always has to be understood in light of these kinds of limitations. I'm adding one more that's a bit unusual to most people, and this is the idea that God must love because that's God's nature. And God's love is self-giving, others empowering, and therefore uncontrolling. Thanks for that good question.
Yeah, great question. Okay, and I think this will be our last one. This comes from Sherman Reed, and it's in particular to our current situation. Does God know the solution to the virus, even though man doesn't?
Oh, I think God does, because God knows all the possibilities that could happen in the world. But because God can't control, God can't download that into somebody's head. God is currently working with our best scientists to arrive at that solution. But because God can't control even the scientist's brain, God can't stick it in there unilaterally. God is calling, luring, persuading, somehow trying to bring us to those kinds of solutions that we need right now that I think God already knows. And so therefore, God's knowledge is also should be understood in light of God's uncontrolling love.
All right. So I think, let me check and make sure. I'm pretty sure that's was our last question there. I think that's good. Okay.
Well, Kaylee on our Zoom chat was just complaining that he has a question, but you cut it short, Cody. It's all your fault.
Wait, okay. I will let Kaylee ask a question. Go ahead, Kaylee, ask your question. You're unmuted.
All right. So my question has to do with the idea that God suffers along with his creation. How do you see your view working along with that idea?
Yeah, I strongly affirm the idea that God suffers with us. That is, that God is truly affected by what happens in the world. And this is part of my answer to the problem of evil. I have what I call a five-fold answer to this question. And one of them is that the God of love is truly affected, is emotionally influenced by what happens in the world. Now, some theologians I know stop with that. They're not willing to rethink God's power. So they say, well, we have the good news that God is present with us during our suffering. And I say, I affirm that good news, but I think we have to go a step further. Let me give an illustration. Suppose after this chat, Cody decides to drive to Seattle this weekend, and I decide to go as well. And we both happen to be on the highway at the same time. He's a little bit in front of me, and he hits some strange black ice. His car starts to tumble. He goes off the side of the road. He's thrown out of his vehicle, but the car lands partially on him. I see this happen in my car following him. I pull over. I run up to Cody, and there's Cody laying there with this car on top of him, trying to breathe, might die. And I say to myself, I could actually push the car off him. Just the way the car is angled, I've got the leverage to push it off and save Cody's life. But I say, God only suffers with us, and suffering with us must be the most important thing. So I get down on my hands and knees and I hold Cody's hand and I say, I'm here with you, buddy. I'm feeling your pain with you. And I let him die. Now, if I do that, that's not a loving thing. If I have the capacity to prevent evil but choose not to, his wife is not going to think I'm a great guy. In the same way, I think God really suffers with us, but God doesn't allow or choose not to prevent evil that God could prevent. I think it's better to say God suffers with us and can't single-handedly prevent evil, but God calls us and all of creation in that evil opposing activity.
All right. Wonderful discussion. Great questions, everybody. I really appreciate it. And we did have quite a few join in through Facebook Live, up to a little over 40 at one point. So I thought that was great. Wonderful questions from there, too. So I appreciate everybody's joining in. Dr. Thomas Jay Oord, thank you so much for being our first guest teacher on Sunday School. And I know I've got people commenting saying, lots of good food for thought for me to wrestle with and think about. So I'm thankful that you gave us some juicy morsels during this time to chew on. We have lots of time to chew on it.
Yeah.
All right, everybody.
Cody.
Thank you on Zoom call for joining in. Thank you on Facebook Live for joining in. Join us in not next week on Easter. We're not going to have a Sunday school then, but we will the week after with another special guest teacher. It's actually my sister, who is a specialist in trauma, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about some things we can do in times of suffering and trauma, how we can respond, and what we can do to maintain health and wholeness, and how we can walk others through times of suffering and trauma as well. All right. Thanks again, everybody, for joining. Tom, we'll see ya.
See y'all later.